Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Racial identity in discourse analysis. Interactive assistant racial identity refers to how individuals and groups define themselves and are defined by others in relation to race. It is shaped by social, political, and historical contexts, and is often influenced by the language and discourse surrounding race. In discourse analysis, racial identity is examined by analyzing how language constructs, reinforces, and challenges racial categories, stereotypes, and power relations. Discourse analysis of racial identity focuses on the ways in which race is talked about, represented, and negotiated in public discourse, media, politics, and everyday conversations. By analyzing the language used to describe race and racial identities, discourse analysis reveals how social hierarchies and inequalities are maintained or contested. It uncovers the implicit or explicit assumptions embedded in conversations about race, and how these discourses shape individual and collective racial identities, often reflecting broader societal power structures. Key features of racial identity in discourse analysis. 1. Construction of racial categories. In discourse, racial categories are often socially constructed and maintained through language. Discourse analysis examines how these categories are defined, reinforced, and contested, revealing the fluidity or rigidity of racial identities in various contexts. Example: in media discourse, terms like people of color or minorities are used to group different racial identities together, while terms like whiteness are often invisible or unmarked. Discourse analysis would explore how these terms categorize and differentiate racial identities, shaping how people are grouped and understood within societal hierarchies. 2. Stereotyping and representation. Public discourse often reinforces racial stereotypes through language, which can limit or distort the representation of racial groups. Discourse analysis investigates how language perpetuates or challenges these stereotypes, and how racial identities are framed in terms of certain traits or behaviors. Example: in news reports about crime, language like gang violence in urban areas is often used in ways that reinforce negative stereotypes about Black or Latino communities. Discourse analysis would examine how these linguistic patterns contribute to racialized perceptions of crime and influence public attitudes toward different racial groups. 3. Racialized power dynamics. Language is a powerful tool for reflecting and reproducing racialized power dynamics. Discourse analysis explores how language constructs power relations between racial groups, often privileging some identities over others, and how these dynamics are maintained or challenged in discourse. Example: in political discourse, phrases like protecting our communities from illegal immigrants frame certain racial groups as threats, reinforcing power imbalances between native-born citizens and immigrant communities. Discourse analysis would investigate how this language constructs racial identities in opposition to one another, reinforcing exclusionary ideologies. 4. Whiteness as the unmarked norm. In many societies, whiteness is often constructed as the unmarked norm, meaning it goes unspoken or is taken for granted as the default racial identity. Discourse analysis examines how whiteness is maintained as an invisible standard against which other racial identities are measured. Example: in advertisements, white individuals may be presented as the default consumers without being explicitly labeled as white, while people of color are often portrayed in ways that highlight their racial identity. Discourse analysis would explore how this invisibility of whiteness reinforces racial hierarchies and marginalizes non-white identities by normalizing white experiences as universal. 5. Intersectionality of racial identity. Racial identity often intersects with other social identities, such as gender, class, and sexuality, creating complex and multifaceted experiences of race. Discourse analysis investigates how language reflects these intersectional identities, and how multiple forms of identity are negotiated in discourse. Example: in discussions about police violence, Black women might be described in terms of both their racial identity and their gender, using terms like angry black woman to marginalize them. Discourse analysis would examine how this intersectional identity is constructed and how language reinforces both racial and gender-based stereotypes. 6. Resistance and racial empowerment. Discourse around race is not only about the reproduction of inequality but also about resistance and empowerment. Discourse analysis looks at how marginalized racial groups use language to assert their identities, challenge stereotypes, and fight for social justice. Example: in the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, phrases like, "say her name," are used to reclaim visibility for black women who have been victims of police violence. Discourse analysis would explore how this language challenges the erasure of black women in public discourse and promotes racial empowerment and collective identity. 7. Language and racial segregation. Language is often a tool used to reinforce racial segregation, both socially and spatially. Discourse analysis explores how language creates and maintains divisions between racial groups, often reflecting broader societal structures of segregation and inequality. Example: in real estate discourse, terms like up-and-coming neighborhoods or urban areas may be coded language for predominantly white or non-white communities. Discourse analysis would investigate how these terms are used to indirectly reference race, perpetuating racial divisions in housing and urban development. Methods for analyzing racial identity in discourse. 1. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, examines how language in discussions about race reflects and reproduces power relations, ideologies, and social structures. CDA focuses on how dominant discourses maintain racial hierarchies and how marginalized voices are included or excluded from public conversations. Example: a CDA of political speeches about immigration might reveal how terms like illegal aliens dehumanize migrants, reinforcing racialized perceptions of threat and exclusion. The analysis would explore how this language reflects broader societal power dynamics that position certain racial groups as outsiders. 2. Frame analysis. Frame analysis investigates how racial issues are framed in public discourse, focusing on which aspects are emphasized and how these frames influence public perceptions of race and identity. Example: in media coverage of racial protests, one frame might describe them as peaceful demonstrations for justice, while another frames them as violent riots. Frame analysis would explore how these different framings shape public attitudes toward the protests and the racial issues at their core. 3. Rhetorical analysis. Rhetorical analysis examines how language is used to persuade and construct racial identities through appeals to ethos, credibility, pathos, emotion, and logos, logic. This method focuses on how language constructs arguments about race and how these arguments influence public opinion. Example: in a speech about racial equality, a politician might use ethos by referencing historical figures like Martin Luther King Jr., pathos by invoking the emotional weight of injustice, and logos by citing statistics on racial inequality. Rhetorical analysis would explore how these rhetorical strategies shape public understanding of racial justice. 4. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis looks at how stories about race are constructed in public discourse, focusing on how racial identities are represented and how these narratives influence collective memory and public attitudes. Example: in discussions about immigration, the narrative might focus on immigrants as hardworking contributors to society, or immigrants as burdens on the economy. Narrative analysis would examine how these stories construct racial identities and influence public policy on immigration. Examples of racial identity in discourse analysis. Example 1. Media coverage of racial protests. In media coverage of racial justice protests, one outlet might describe the events as peaceful marches for civil rights, while another refers to them as violent riots disrupting the city. Discourse analysis would explore how these contrasting frames shape public perception of the protests and the racial identities of the participants, with one framing legitimizing the protesters' cause and the other delegitimizing it. Example 2. Political discourse on immigration. In political discourse, immigrants might be framed as hardworking individuals seeking a better life, or as illegal aliens threatening our borders. Discourse analysis would investigate how these different framings construct racial identities of immigrants, influencing public attitudes toward immigration policy and racialized perceptions of national identity. Example 3. Corporate diversity initiatives. In corporate discourse about diversity, companies might use language like, "We value inclusion and are committed to hiring people of all backgrounds," to project an image of racial equality. Discourse analysis would explore how this language constructs racial identity in the workplace and whether it reflects genuine commitment to diversity or functions as corporate branding with little impact on systemic inequality. Example 4. Racial identity in social media movements. In movements like #Black Lives Matter, hashtags such as #SayHerName or #StopAsianHate are used to draw attention to racial injustices. Discourse analysis would investigate how these hashtags and the surrounding discourse construct racial identities, giving visibility to marginalized groups and challenging dominant racial narratives in public spaces. Example 5. Racial representation in advertising. In advertising, companies may attempt to appeal to diverse audiences by including racial diversity in their visuals and messaging, with phrases like, "For everyone, no matter where you come from." Discourse analysis would examine how this language constructs inclusive racial identities and whether it genuinely reflects societal diversity or simply functions as tokenism. Challenges in analyzing racial identity through discourse. 1. Implicit racial bias. Racial identity is often shaped by implicit biases that can be difficult to detect in language. Discourse analysts must carefully analyze subtle linguistic choices that may reinforce racial stereotypes or inequalities without being overtly racist. 2. Global versus local contexts. Racial identity and the language surrounding it can vary significantly across global and local contexts, with different historical, cultural, and political influences shaping how race is talked about and understood. Discourse analysts must account for these variations when analyzing racial identity. 3. Intersectionality. Racial identity often intersects with other aspects of identity, such as gender, class, and sexuality. Discourse analysts must be attentive to how these intersecting identities influence the way race is constructed and experienced in different contexts. Conclusion. Racial identity is deeply embedded in the language we use to talk about race, power, and belonging. Through discourse analysis, researchers can explore how language constructs, reinforces, or challenges racial categories, stereotypes, and power dynamics. By analyzing media, political rhetoric, social movements, and everyday conversations, discourse analysis uncovers the ways in which racial identities are negotiated and the role language plays in shaping public attitudes and behaviors toward race. Understanding how racial identity is constructed through discourse is essential for addressing racial inequalities and promoting social justice. Frequently asked questions. What is racial identity in discourse analysis? Racial identity in discourse analysis refers to how language shapes the way individuals and groups are defined and perceived in terms of race. It studies how discourse constructs, reinforces, or challenges racial categories and stereotypes, reflecting broader social, political, and power dynamics. How does language construct racial categories? Language constructs racial categories by grouping individuals and defining identities in specific terms. For example, terms like people of color or minorities shape perceptions of diverse groups, while the invisibility of whiteness as the default category can reinforce racial norms. Discourse analysis uncovers how these categories maintain or challenge social hierarchies. What role do stereotypes play in racial identity discourse? Stereotypes in language can perpetuate limiting or harmful views of racial groups. For instance, media language like gang violence in urban crime reporting often reinforces negative racial stereotypes. Discourse analysis investigates how such patterns impact public attitudes and contribute to racialized perceptions of communities. How do power dynamics manifest in racial identity discourse? Racialized power dynamics in language can privilege certain groups while marginalizing others. Political language like, protecting our communities from illegal immigrants, constructs some racial groups as threats. Discourse analysis examines how such language upholds exclusionary ideologies and societal hierarchies. Why is whiteness often considered the unmarked norm in discourse? whiteness is frequently constructed as the unmarked or invisible standard, assumed to be the default racial identity. In advertising, for instance, white individuals may appear as the default consumers, while people of color are explicitly marked by their racial identities. Discourse analysis explores how this normalization reinforces racial power structures. How does intersectionality affect racial identity in discourse? Intersectionality highlights how racial identity intersects with gender, class, and other social categories, influencing how identities are constructed and experienced. For example, the term, angry black woman, captures how racial and gender biases intersect. Discourse analysis uncovers how language reflects these layered identities and their societal impacts. Can discourse challenge racial stereotypes and promote empowerment? Yes, language can be used to resist and challenge racial stereotypes. Movements like #Black Lives Matter use phrases such as, "say her name," to reclaim visibility and challenge the erasure of black women in discussions about racial violence. Discourse analysis examines how these forms of resistance create space for marginalized voices and foster collective identity. What are some methods for analyzing racial identity in discourse? Critical discourse analysis, CDA, examines how language reflects and maintains race-related power relations and ideologies. Frame analysis investigates how racial issues are presented or downplayed in public discourse. Rhetorical analysis focuses on persuasive strategies in discourse about race. Narrative analysis analyzes how stories about race are told and their impact on public attitudes. Can racial identity discourse vary across cultural contexts? Yes, racial identity discourse is influenced by local and global contexts. Different historical, cultural, and political backgrounds shape how race is discussed and understood. Discourse analysts must consider these contextual differences when studying how language reflects and constructs racial identity. What challenges exist in analyzing racial identity through discourse? Challenges include detecting implicit racial bias, which may be subtly embedded in language, and addressing the complexity of intersectionality. Additionally, variations in racial discourse across different cultural and political contexts require a nuanced analysis to ensure accuracy and relevance.